on the dark path. Only now entering the woods on the footpath did Anne-Marie realize how cold the dawn was. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned sweaters and jackets and coats, and she had peered into the night, following them with her eyes as they moved silently off, bulky in their garments, blankets in their arms. But she wore only a light sweater over her cotton dress. Though the October day, later, would be warmed by sunlight, now it was gray, chilly, and damp. She shivered. The path curved, and she could no longer look back behind her to see the clearing of the farmhouse outlined against the pale sky and the lightening of the meadow behind. Now there were only the dark woods ahead. Underfoot, the path latticed with roots hidden under the fallen leaves was invisible. She felt her way with her foot, trying not to stumble. The handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through her sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had often told Christy as they cuddled in their bed at night. Once upon a time there was a little girl, she told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. Her mother had made it for her. She wore it so often that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. Christy would always interrupt her there. Why is it called Red Riding Hood? Christy would ask. Why didn't they just call her Little Red Cloak? Well, it had been a hood, and it covered her head. She had beautiful curls like you, Christy. Maybe someday Mamma will make you a coat with a hood to cover your curls to keep you warm. But why? Christy would ask. Why is it Riding Hood? Was she riding a horse? Maybe she had a horse that she rode sometimes, but not in this story. Now stop interrupting every minute. Amory smiled, feeling her way through the dark, remembering how Christy always interrupted stories to ask questions. Often she just waited to make the story wanted to make the story longer and make it last longer. The story continued. One day the little girl's mother said, I want you to take a basket of food to your grandmother. She is sick in bed. Come, let us tie your red cloak. The grandmother lived deep in the woods, didn't she? Christy would ask. In the dangerous woods where wolves lived. Amory heard small noises, a squirrel, perhaps a rabbit scampering nearby. She paused, stood still on the path, and smiled again. Christy would have been frightened. She would have grabbed Anne Marie's hand and said, Woof! But Anne Marie knew that these woods were not like the woods in the story. There were no wolves, no bears or tigers, none of the beasts that populated Christie's vivid imagination. She hurried on. Still, they were very dark, these woods. Amory had never followed this path in the dark before. She had told her mother she would run, and she tried. Here the path turned, and she knew the turning the the turning well, though it seemed different in the dark. If she turned to the left, it would take her to the road, out where it would be lighter, wider, more traveled, but more dangerous too. Someone could see her on the road. At this time of the dawn, the other fishermen would be on the road, hurrying to get to their boats for the long day at sea, and there might be soldiers. So she turned to the right, headed deeper into the woods. It was why Mamma and Peter had needed to guide those who were strangers here. The Rosens and the others, a one wrong turn would have taken them into danger. So Little Red Riding Hood carried her basket of food and hurried along through the woods. It was a lovely morning, and the birds were singing. Little Red Riding Hood sang too, and she walked. Sometimes she changed that part of the story, telling it to Christy. Sometimes it was raining or even snowing in the woods. Sometimes it was evening with long, frightening shadows, so that Christy was listening, would snuggle closer and wrap her arms around Anne Marie. But now, telling it to herself, she wanted the sunlight and a bird song. Here, the path widened and flattened. It was a place where the woods opened up on one side of the path, curved beside the meadow on the edge of the sea. Here she could run, and run she did. Here in the daylight there would be cows in the meadow, and in the summer afternoons Amory would always stop by the fence and hold out handfuls of grass, which the curious cows would take with their rough tongues. Here her mother had told her Mamma would always stop, too, as a child, walking to school. Her dog Trofast would wriggle under the fence and run about about in the meadow, barking excitedly, trying to chase the cows who always ignored him. The meadow was empty now and colorless in the half light. She could hear the churning of the sea beyond, and see the wash of the daylight in the east over Sweden. She ran as fast as she could, searching with her eyes in the place ahead where the path would re-enter the woods in the final segment which led to town. Here, the bushes were overgrown, and it was difficult to see the path here. But she found the entrance beside the high blueberry bushes. How she often had stopped here in the late summer to pick a handful of sweet berries. Her hands and her mouth would be blue afterwards. Mamma would always laugh when she came home. Now it was dark again. The trees and bushes closed around her, and she had to move more slowly, though she still tried to run. Emery thought of Mamma, her ankle so swollen, her face so pained. She hoped Mamma had called the doctor by now. The local doctor was an old man, brisk and businesslike, though with kind eyes. He had come to the farmhouse several times during the summers in the past. His battered car noisy on the dirt road, and he had come once when Christy, a tiny baby, then had been sick and wailing with an earache. And he had come when Lisa had spilled hot grease cooking breakfast and burned her hand. Anne-Marie turned again on the path divided once more. The left fork would take you directly to the village. It was the way they had come from the train, and the way Mamma had walked to school as a girl. But Anne-Marie turned right, heading now towards the harbor side, where the fishing boats lay at anchor. And she had often come this way before, too, sometimes at the end of the afternoon to pick out the Ingemborg, Uncle Henrik's boat, from the many returning, and to watch him and his helpers up unload the day's catch of slippery, shimmering herring, still flopping in their containers. Ev- even now, with the boats in the harbor ahead, the empty of fish, preparing to leave for the day's fishing, she could smell the oily, salty scent of herring, which always remained in the air here. Wasn't far now, and she was getting lighter. She ran as fast as she had run at school in the Friday foot races, almost as fast as she ran down the Copenhagen sidewalk when the day the soldier had stopped her with the call of halt. Amory continued the story in her head. Suddenly, the Little Red Riding Hood walked through the woods. She heard a noise. She heard rustling in the bushes. A wolf, Christy would say, always shivering with fearful delight. I know it's going to be the wolf. Amory always tried to prolong this part, to build up the suspense and tantalize her. She didn't know what it was, but she stopped on the path and she listened to something that was following her in the bushes. The Little Red Riding Hood was very, very, very frightened. She would stop, would stay silent for a moment, and beside her in the bed she could feel Christie's holding her breath. Then Amory would go on in a low, dread-filled voice. She heard a growl. Amory stopped suddenly and stood still on the path. There was a turn immediately ahead, and beyond it she knew, as soon as she rounded that turn, she would see the landscape open to the sea. The woods would be behind her. Ahead of her would be the harbor and the docks and the countless fishing boats. Very soon it would be noisy there, with engines starting, fishermen calling to one another, and gulls calling. But she had heard something else. She heard the rushing bushes rustling ahead. She heard footsteps, and she was certain it was not her imagination. She heard a growl. Cautiously she took a step forward and then another, and then she approached the turn of the path, and the noises continued. Then they were there, in front of her, 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glistening and their lips curled.